I got that tattoo in East St. Louis.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Went with 3 different fellas, and the next day, both their arms were all swollen up. Mine was still okay, and I told them I drank a better brand than they did. But I enlisted when I was 18 and a half. Pearl Harbor was bombed, and we were suddenly aware that we were going to be in war, and I was young and eager to enlist. And my folks talked me out of going right then. I was a senior in high school, and I finished high school, and then a few months later enlisted in 1942. I was with a group of buddies. We were in a theater in Waterbury, Connecticut, and when we came out of the theater, everybody was, they weren't celebrating, they were all talking about Pearl Harbor, and most of us didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was, but that was our first acknowledgement of it, Pearl Harbor. The start of the war there is what made me enlist. I had no desire to go in before that, but I grew up with people that were all patriots, and that was the thing to do. Not everybody. Some people got drafted, but they still did the same job. But by enlisting, you should get a better choice of what you would do. Not always happened, but that's why I enlisted. Actually, I think it just changed from $21 a month to $50 a month when I enlisted. And that was for a private. So there's no difference whether he enlisted or got drafted. Now, first I went to Hartford, Connecticut, and we were given exams. And of the 4 of us, I was the only one that passed the physical. So I was then shipped to Fort Devens, Massachusetts. It was a center for a large military base. And that's where you took your basic. Well, not your basic, your enlistment. And I was there just, maybe 10 days. They outfitted us, and basically that's what we did. And then I went to basic. And basic was in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And the government had bought or rented hotels to put all the troops in. They weren't prepared for as many people all of a sudden being in the service. So I actually lived in the Ritz-Carlton in Atlantic City and had meals in the Ambassador. And I was on the 6th floor of the Ritz-Carlton, and the bad part of that was you had to walk all 6 floors. If you were on the 7th floor, you got to use the elevator. But the training in Atlantic City, we got a lot of drilling, and most of it on the beaches, but some they marched off to a small field. We had no guns, we had broomsticks. It was not a great basic training. We did learn a lot about the military, and obeying orders and that type of stuff. Then they picked me to go to radio operator school. We were lined up in a hotel and given numbers 1 to 5, and the number 1 step to go to one school. Well, I got radio school. I wanted engineering school, but I got radio operator, and went to Scottsfield, Illinois. It was a big base. It's right near St. Louis. And I was taught how to do Morse code, did an awful lot of hours just listening and typing Morse code. Had our regular physical training and that type of stuff. She was a German broadcaster, and I think the first mission that I turned in, welcome to the fatherland or something, boys of the 315. Yeah. They had our number. Yeah. Pilot says, don't put that on again, because they knew we were coming. Mm-hmm. But the part of the detector was they knew you were there, but they didn't have your same height in exactly your same direction. But they knew you were up there. They could hit a bird at 30,000. One of the guys that came in to rescue us 2 days later, they never stopped the old DC-3, I guess it was. One of them took a picture of this, and we had 250 holes in that tail. Not counting what else we had. And these guns were 50 caliber, and this is where they were racked up. And this one was a different sight than what we had. We just had a radical type sight. This must be a later one. This was the radio room, and we did everything by Morse code. It's locked down back here. And I was also a radar jammer, so I had an extra transmitter and a couple of receivers, so that I would pick up the enemy gun radar and transmit on the same frequency. So it's supposed to block it. I don't know whether it did or not, but that was it. This particular spot here used to have a place to put a 50 caliber gun on, but it only had a cone of very small cone, just fire straight up. So our plane didn't even mount it. We kept it for spare parts. And these things here were different. We used to change frequencies quite often. So these were different sets that we would use. And this side over here, we usually had a lot of packages of tinfoil that we used to let out during a mission to block their radar. So that was part of the radio operator's job. Somewhere here we had a hole for cameras, and that's where we would do it. But that was my main duty here, so I didn't fire a gun in this particular position. And while we were over the target, I was most busy because I'm trying to jam. And so out of this window, you don't see very much. And fortunately, outside of the flak, you didn't see much out of the top. And the interesting part was we flew about 30,000 feet, and the temperature was 55 below. And we had a throat mic on, and we had a heated suit under our jumpsuit, and then a fur-lined jacket and pants, and kind of cumbersome to get around. And then we also had a flak suit that we put over that. This is the flak suit, and we had these kind of gloves and these kind of boots, but underneath we wore it looked like a flight suit, you know. And under that it looked like underwear with wires in it. And here's your throat mic up here, and you, of course, you had to have an oxygen mask on, and that was about it. When we I went overseas in a Liberty ship. It took 28 days to go to Italy from Newport News, Virginia, and we landed in Naples and then went to Foggia. And when I got to Foggia, they assigned me to the 301st Bomb Group and 353rd Bomb Squadron, and they told me I'm going to be the new radar jammer, and I didn't even have an idea what it was. They said, we'll train you. And so I had a couple hours of what to do, and that was it. And most of the time when you were the radar jammer, that plane was tail end Charlie, which is the least desirable position, because most of the fighters would come in from behind. So the crew weren't too happy that I was the jammer. However, we did what we had to do. We had a Made West available that was if you bailed out over water, you would just strap that on. Naturally, you got rid of your flak jacket, and it was easy to get out of. Ordinarily, you just pull a cord or something, and that was it. And we were supposed to, back by the back door there, leave our shoes, because we had on boots and heated equipment, but most of us never remembered our shoes when you bailed out, and I was one of them. So when I landed, all I had was these, they almost looked like long underwear with feet in them, but they had wires for heat. So that was one of the things that was tough about it, getting around. This here was the Bombay, and between here and the pilot. And one of our missions, our bombs got hung up, and so my engineer, who was in the top turret forward there, him and I went out there on the little catwalk and kicked the bombs out. And we were out there, and a few years later, when my wife and we went to a reunion, and he's talking about it, and he says, when I looked over, he says, Arch's eyes were as big as saucers. And I said, so were yours. We were both doing what we had to do, but we were not happy campers.
You didn't want to kick a bomb.
No, but that's what we had to do. And my worst experience as far as myself, we were hit by flak, and my oxygen line got hit. So I was sitting at the radio thing, and all of a sudden I just passed out. And I didn't even realize, it felt like I was going to sleep. But my waist gunner there spotted me, and I'm on the floor, and my fingers are already turning blue, and he slapped on oxygen. I was okay. And the way crews were, you know, you did it as part of your job, like kicking the bombs out. He came and rescued me. And I told his family, I said, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. And he said, what do you mean? And I says, well, you saved me on my oxygen. he couldn't even remember because he did it part of his job. So it was, the bombs varied. We had different types of bombs, and a couple of flights we had an extra tank of gas in there so that we could fly farther, carried less bombs, but we were able to go to a target farther away. We were shot down over Bleckheimer, Germany, and we had dropped our bombs, but we got hit over the target, and one engine was out and the other one was gyrating, and they couldn't seem to control it, and we were shaking like heck. So the pilot told us, prepare to bail out, but not bail out, just prepared. However, the engineer was able to feather the prop and we were able to continue. But we had just two engines, and one of them wasn't really performing at full strength, so we headed back to Italy. But when we got to Yugoslavia, they decided that they couldn't make it back. So we went into the island of Vis, which is a small island, and General Teeter, head of the partisans' headquarters, were there. I didn't know it at the time. I found out from history that's where he was. But anyway, we were able to come in. It wasn't really a crash landing, but the runway was short, so we had to stop quicker than we wanted, but we made it. The two waist gunners put parachutes out to help stop us. Whether it helped or not, I don't know, but we made it okay. And of course, once we didn't return, they had us, although we contacted by radio. There was two British radio men on that island, and the rest were partisans from Tito's group, and they were communists, but they were on our side. There was three types of Yugoslavs, the Ustashio, and they were deadly against us. If you saw a U on their hat, you didn't want to surrender. And the other one, I can't remember exactly what the name is right now, but they were kind of in between. If you could take your escape money, and that, which was, I think it was $48, one for each state at that time, and you could buy them off. But we didn't have that chance. But anyway, they had me missing in action, but 2 days later they came and got us. And
what was going through your head when they showed up to pick you guys up?
Oh, we're pretty happy, but I can't really think. We weren't, I guess it was part of the deal. You just, one thing, we had pretty good morale, and we always figured we're going to make it one way or the other. And my pilot left my engineer and I with the plane to take care of it while they went to this Radio Shack with the rest of them. And these Yugoslavs came in, the partisans, and they started taking the plane apart. And when the pilot came back, he says, "What the hell's wrong with you?" Well, we didn't even carry a sidearm, and they were there with Tommy guns, but they were friendly. And I even had some wine with one of them, and he gave me a little red star, and without thinking, I put it in my flight suit. And that's all I thought about it. But when I got shot down the second time, they discovered a little red star there, the Gestapo, and they thought I might be tied in with the underground. That I have a tattoo that says U.S. Air Force on it, and they kind of let that go. But
so the day that when you guys took off, when you were shot down the second time, did it feel like any normal day, or was there something funny about it, or?
No, the second time it was supposed to be a milk run. It was Marlborough, Yugoslavia, and it was a railroad center. And we weren't supposed to hit much opposition, maybe some fighters, but they didn't expect much. And they didn't expect a lot of heavy guns. which was wrong. We got the heavy guns. I didn't see fighters there. Well, they were there, because when we got back to the island of Vis, the Tuskegee Airmen had picked us up for escorts, and one of them, I found out later, was Colonel Davis at that time, and he was the first block commander that was flying escort, and he later became general. And the Tuskegee Airmen were great. They really protected us. And one of the missions I was on was, I'm not sure whether it was Vienna or Munich, but we screwed up and we didn't rendezvous when we were supposed to. So when we got to the target, they had already been there, and they cleared the skies pretty well of all the fighters. And so we didn't get what we could have got if it wasn't them. But he followed us back because we were all alone, and in trouble. We were going at the slowest speed. We threw all our guns and everything that was movable out to stay up. But he just followed us in, and once we got land, he just waved his wings and went off. So I have a lot of respect for the Tuskegee. I'm one of their supporters, that they look to keep a 51 goes around the country, and they talk to students, and part of their motto is never give up, and it's a good organization. And we flew out of Italy, so a lot of the flights were pretty long, and most of my targets were big cities, Vienna, Munich, Blechheimer. Was not a big city, but that was a big, I believe, factory. What it made exactly, I don't know. But the guns from the plus the oil field were right at Marlborough, a lot of them on trains. And when we hit that target, which was the target I was shot down on my 17th, we passed over the target, and we didn't get much action from anything, and we dropped our bombs, but not everybody dropped their bombs, so the commander said, we'll make a 360 and finish dropping them. Well, when we went around on the 360s, they zeroed in on us, and it was 28 of us, and they knocked down 7 of us. And so that's 7 times 10 men on a crew. And our plane, we bailed out, but we were able to see it blow up after we bailed up, so we were lucky to get out.
So what was it like when you're rushing, getting your parachute on and getting ready to just bail out? What was going through your head?
Nothing was going through. It was just do what you had. You got your parachute on. The pilot, the tail gunner, we were on fire, and he said their flames are coming back to the tail, and he just left. He crawled out of there and he went out, and then the pilot said everybody bail out. And I got back to the waist gunner, and one waist gunner standing there and not doing anything, so I helped him out with my foot, and the other guy jumped out after him, and then I went, and we were the last 3 out of this end of it. And the fellows that were in front, from the engineer and navigator, bombardier, and 2 pilots, they went out through the nose, that little hole you saw coming in here, and the navigator was wounded, but they hooked up his parachute and got him out, and he landed, and he didn't get captured. And the co-pilot took the flak out of him with a penknife, I guess, from what they tell me. We were lucky to get out of the thing, and that part of it. And the plane I was in was on its last mission. that it was supposed to fly. It was called Old Willie, and it was the only flight I flew in it, and it had 160 missions. So it was kind of a history type plane. And the second, once we got shot down, I was picked up in the mountains, and a Hungarian troop picked me up. My chute had got hung up in the trees, and I think I got knocked out because I didn't remember exactly hitting, but within a short time I was close to the ground. I just could drop out of it, but the chute was there in the tree, so they could find me pretty quickly. And I started running, and I didn't get very far. They had dogs, and a young troop, I threw my hands up, learned my German word, comrade. And I think he was as scared as I was. But a German sergeant came along, and he could speak some English, and he looked at me. He said, "Oh, the war must be getting over," because I looked young. So he said, "The Americans are using Kinder, which is children." And he treated me halfway decent, and I got a ride out of the hills there on an ox cart down to a little city, and then the Gestapo, they just they strip searched me and questioned me some, but they weren't bad to me. And then they threw me in a cell that was about the size of this radio room with a couple of wooden bunks in it, no lights, no windows. And I went in there, and during the night they opened the door and somebody else came in, and didn't know who it was. Nobody talked. In the morning, when they opened again, it happened to be my engineer. And from that day on, we were inseparable. We were buddies, and I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for him, and vice versa.
What was it like when you realized it was him in the cell with you? What was the first thing you guys said?
Oh, we just hugged one another, and that was it. And we're glad to know that we're both alive, because we didn't know who made it and who didn't. And we found out shortly after that 2 others were captured, and that's all we heard. But we didn't know till months later that our crew had got back to Italy with the partisans. And but they took us from the little city there up to, first stop I had was Graz, Austria, and that was one of the air bases we bombed about, probably 10 days before, and it wasn't a desirable place to be prisoner. And we were kept with German prisoners. We were treated almost like a German. And so we were a short stay there, and then they took us train ride up through Austria into a place near Frankfurt called Dulag Luft, and that's where they interrogated all Air Force that they could get there. But by the time they got me there, my information, I'm told, it was considered cold because it was a few weeks later, and I wasn't mistreated there. The officer didn't force other than name, rank, and serial number. But then he brought out a book on me. He said, "Well, I'll tell you a little what we know." And he knew what high school I went to. A lot of things that I had forgotten or wouldn't think they would know. And so I spent a few more days there. They gave us clothing. And then I went by civilian train across to where Stalag Luft 4 was. And some of the guys that had gone there before had to be forced run from the train into the camp, and were kind of mistreated that way. But I wasn't. We marched into it, and it was, like I say, a large camp. When we were assigned to a barracks, and the barracks were built for 16 bunks, we had 26 in the room, so we slept on. New man, I slept on the floor naturally, and the time in the camp was not nothing joyful, but you could survive it. They fed just enough. We got a little bit of Red Cross. The weather was cold, but the barracks weren't warm, but they weren't freezing either. We had a little coal stove, and we got so many bricks of coal each day. And the food was not great, but we survived. But on February 6th in 45, the Russians were coming onto that camp, so they decided to evacuate the camp. So 4,500 of us were assigned to walk out on a march, and we're told that it'd be a few days. And so we left with that idea, and I had pretty good amount of clothes. I had the regular GI uniform, plus I got RAF jacket. So I was warmer than some guys. I won them in a card game, or cigarettes were your money. And for some reason, my partner and we got control of cigarettes for a few days. But once the march came, we had to give them all away. And we could keep 5 packs. And so I started out better than a lot of the... and this partner at that time was not the fellow I was shot down with, my engineer. We got separated, and it was a fellow from Connecticut, where I had been from. So he kind of took me under his arm. He had been a prisoner over a year, and he knew the ropes, and him and I got into he got cigarettes, because if you were there about 6 months, you might get a carton of cigarettes from home. So he had some, and he got me in the game with him, and we were winners. But the march started out, and after about 6-7 days, you'd see the guys that couldn't carry everything they had and be getting rid of it. And we just continued. And one of the worst days we had was, it was February 14th, Valentine's Day, and we went to this city of Swinemundy, but we couldn't quite make it, and it was snowing. We hadn't had anything for breakfast or anything, and it was snowing, and we finally couldn't make it to the barn they were going to take us to, so they just camped us right there, and it was a swampy area, wet and snowy, and so we had a terrible night.
How were they treating you guys on the march?
They kind of left us alone. Some of the guards were bad, but most of them treated it as humans. And I had one guard who was probably the age of my father, and he was in what they called their home guard, so that's why he was a guard, but he couldn't speak English, and I didn't know German. But we communicated a little bit, and I was able to trade. One thing I traded was a sweater that I had gotten, but it was full of lice, which we were covered with lice. And so he traded it for me for a loaf of bread. And I don't trade it in the daytime. He traded it to a civilian girl or something, and I got a loaf of bread for it. But he said, why not trade it in the daytime? I says, because it'll walk away. And so he did that for me. And near the end, when the march was, well, I guess the Germans knew better than we did, but he was taken off. He was in a section where he had lived. So he took off, and he gave me a bayonet. He says, you may need it more than I do, and I still have that bayonet. I put it in my overcoat. Never was detected or anything. Didn't ever have a use for it, but so they weren't all bad. But there was one in Stalag 4, one particular guard, and he was called Big Stoop, and he was about 6'6", and he was their guy that dished out the punishment. So if somebody messed up somewhere, they put you in this little chamber, and you sent a couple days there on bread and water, and he'd beat the heck out of some of them guys. But once we're liberated, when we were interrogated, most of us mentioned his name, and they let us know that we didn't have to worry. The British got him, and they beheaded him and strung him up in a town square. So he was taken care of. But overall, most of the guards weren't bad, but some of them were still real fascists. And so you always had to be careful how you were. My engineer did get away for a few days on the march, and he got to a barn, and he hid in the barn figuring the Russians are coming, he'll get liberated. But he was spotted by a girl, and she turned him into the Germans, and he got sent back with us, and he ended up better than we did because he got a Red Cross package when he was captured again. But we continued, and I was liberated on the 80th day of the march. I was at a town near Bitterfield where the Americans and Russians joined together at the Elbe River, and the eastern side of the Elbe was Russian, the western side was American, and I was on the Russian side, and they sent one MP across a pontoon bridge or something, and with a metal detector, and there was probably 300 of our group, and the town put their little flag white sheets out surrendering, and they were hoping that we would take it so the Russians didn't, but he led us back. 104th Division of Patton's group were there, and they debriefed us somewhat. Somewhat gave us some kind of physical, like, is your heart beating? This very minimum, but we were able to walk, so we were okay. We were a few days there. They sent us into France to a hospital, and my engineer and I looked around the hospital. We got there at night. In the morning, when we got really to see what was going on, most of the guys there were in bad shape. They weren't all ex-prisoner of war. Some of them were wounded vets and in bad shape. And so we were still able to get around. We were there mostly because of our dysentery and urinary. So we decided to leave, and we hitchhiked by motor, our military motor, up to Le Havre, France, and that's where all the prisoners were sent to go back to the States. And
so when you were liberated, was there a firefight, or was it did they just kind of surrender?
There was nothing that I could see. There was nothing right in that area. You could hear guns off, but the Russians came in with big tanks right to where we were.
They just kind of appeared. That's all you saw?
Yeah, and they didn't stop us from marching out. I had friends that were liberated by the Russian and held by them for quite a while before they were let go by them. They were negotiated out, so we were fortunate. It was front line for them, but they weren't in action right there. But you could hear the guns still going, and the guns fired up right up to May 7th, I think, when they actually stopped all the fighting. And But anyway, we got to Le Havre, and we had no money, nothing, and we were given a few bucks, but they were really not much use for us. Except when we first got there was a Red Cross table set up for coffee and donut and that type of thing. But they were charging so much for that, and we had nothing. So we went down the street, and the Salvation had one set up, and it was free. And I heard that some of the GIs took care of the Red Cross table. They just turned everything over and let them know how unhappy. But after there, quite a while, General Eisenhower, we were making quite a bit of noise about getting back to the States, and he came and addressed us, and they decided they would double load all the ships and planes that they could to take us back. So I eventually got, I think the 16th of June, I left for the States, and I was on a hospital ship, and it was double loaded. So if you had a bunk, after 12 hours you swapped with somebody else and you went on the deck. And we were in there the first day when the two Marines came down and says, "Okay, time to move." Nobody moved. And they said, "You got to do its orders." Nobody moved. So these two Marines left. I never seen them get defeated, but the guys didn't give a damn. And they, but after a day or so, we all swapped bunks. And took about 10 days. Got to Newport News, and they didn't know what the heck to do with us. They had so many coming in. They gave us a 60-day furlough. I saw a doctor who did nothing. I was okay. By then, my dysentery had stopped. And while in Le Havre, France, they had fattened me up. Every time you turned around, they gave you an eggnog or some chicken or something. So guys you hadn't seen in 2 or 3 weeks, and you saw them, you call them fat so-and-so, you know, and we were... But anyway, I got a 60-day furlough and to Connecticut, and got some money, got a gas ration, because gas was rationed, and I think I got 4 gallons. So one of my friends was able to use that because I didn't have a car or anything. But the 60 days went fast, and then the war in Japan ended in August. So I was there in the streets of Waterbury, and everybody celebrating, and you could get drunk if you wanted in a few minutes. Everybody was high. But then I was sent back to Atlantic City for what they called rehab. There was no rehab. I spent a few days there. Fortunately for me, the woman that I married, we were not even engaged, but we were going to be. And her brother lived in Camden near Atlantic City, so she was able to visit there and for a few days. The only requirement we had to be was in our bunks in the morning at a certain time for roll call. And that the few days I was there, they were trying to listen to us, but not much was heard. And I was sent up to Long Island to a small air base there, and I got the clerk in Atlantic City to list me as a clerk non-typist, but I was a tech sergeant. So when I got to Long Island base, they kind of laughed and said, "We don't have any such thing." And they checked my MOS, and I said, "Well, you went to gunnery school, so go to the armament shop." And the day I went there, the sergeant in charge, which was another tech sergeant, and he had been stationed there and running it, and he was pretty happy. And I said, "What are you happy about?" He says, "Because you're my replacement. You're now chief armor." And I said, "Well, I don't know a damn thing outside of 50 gallon." He said, "Well, there's 2 PFCs here that they know everything. Treat them right and you're all set." So that's what I did. These 2 guys were experts in what they did, but they always screwed up and they kept getting busted. So they were there, but I made sure that they got a pass on the weekend and things like this. So the time was, I wasn't there very long, and made friends with the officer on the base, and time went pretty quick. Then I got sent to Fort Devens, and they decided then anybody who was a prisoner 30 days didn't have to have your records all complete. So I was able to get discharged and went home to Waterbury, Connecticut. So that's a quick summary of what happened.